at the end of last week's episode, we were just getting to the point where Camus was summarising some of the ways in which Soviet communism exemplifies or acts out the rebellion, as Camus defines it. And he was about to just quote a few rather remarkable statements made by some of the people involved. So we'll just go through that now. So he says, first of all, rebellion involves, sort of this Hegelian nihilistic rebellion involves renouncing all values. We've talked about that in the last couple of weeks. But one of the values that it must renounce is rebellion itself, which is, I'm not quite sure how that works out in practice. He talks again about Germany, so I'm not quite sure if this is Marx that he's quoting when he says this, but because Marx was anticipating a communist rebellion in Germany before it happened in Russia. So he says, Germany will be freed of all its oppressors by every German losing his freedom. And so the dialectic in that situation is, the thesis is men should be free. The antithesis is many men are being oppressed by others. The synthesis then is restrict the freedom of everybody. So if all people are oppressed and enslaved, then there is no longer any oppressor. So there was equality. There's no difference between one and the other. There's no ruling class. There's no oppressed class, or everybody's a slave. So you've solved the problem of human freedom. That's one idea. Then Engels, talks about the disappearance of whole races, and then just looks forward to that. I think, quoting Marx again, I think history will be continually rewritten. We've looked at that in the last few episodes. And then this statement that if one forms a friendship with a real present man, someone who's living now in this world that we live in, by doing that one is opposing oneself to the perfect man to come. And in doing that one is perhaps frustrating this onward progression of history. So the response to that must be we should be ready to accuse each other now. Be friends just with the state but not with individual people, so be ready to accuse everybody in order to usher in this perfect man. So again, that's right out of, that's what happened in the Soviet Union, of course. People denounced their friends, their family, their neighbours, and that's again typical of what we would, if you look at Orwell's 1984, so that's actually what is described there and was acted out in the USSR. And then again, even perhaps more alarmingly, he talks about propaganda and torture and sleep deprivation, and says that those practices are useful in that they allow us to discover the end, or the limits, I suppose, of the human being, and perhaps push beyond them. So if you can persuade people to believe something which is patently untrue, if you can make them suffer something that they don't wish to suffer, then you're approaching the ends, not the conclusion of, but the limits of the human being, and actually exploring what is described as a new physics of the human. So these are the ideas that are being promoted. I'm not sure who is actually quoting, but people who are expounding those ideas, promoting them as valuable things to be acted out, and which were acted out to a large extent in the USSR. Another one says, history and expediency will be the only judges in the universe, in a universe of trial. We try to find out what is good and bad, what is right and wrong, whether people have done the right thing, whether they've failed, whether they've committed crimes. And in the past we've used morality and religion and law to discover those things. Not so in the future, he says, in this, as history progresses and evolves, the only judges will be history itself and expediency. And also, those who are guilty must be punished immediately. So in religion, whoever this is that Camus quoting says, in religion the punishment was put up to some future date, perhaps to some day of judgment or to some realm that one reaches after leaving this world. And that religion talks about punishment there. But in this march forward of history, the punishment must come immediately. So he complains that the first rebel, Prometheus, that we've looked at also in some of these episodes, wouldn't accept punishment. He rebelled against the higher gods by bringing fire and knowledge to human beings and became, as we've talked about a few times, became a hero to people like Shelley and Byron. But that Prometheus didn't want to accept his punishment. He was forced to receive it anyway by the higher gods. But according to this, I think it's Marx is quoting, I'm not sure anyway, but history will be the implacable judge. And in fact, history will be nothing but punishment. And everyone will willingly subject themselves to it and allow themselves to be punished. And leading on from that idea, he says he uses the term empire, which I think, I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but presumably this ultimate end of history that one might achieve. Maybe not. But in the empire, everyone will be presumed to be hostile or potentially hostile and must continually demonstrate faith, not just lip service, but demonstrate real faith in the order of that empire. So again, that's straight out of 1984. One has to not just say, as Winston Smith tried to do, I love Big Brother. His inquisitor said, no, that's not acceptable. You have to really mean it. You have to really love Big Brother. And until you do that, you'll continue to be punished. And so this quote here says, there will be a race of culprits who will be endlessly shuffling towards an impossible innocence under the grim reward of the Grand Inquisitor. So everyone must be presumed to be guilty, must accept their guilt, must be continually admitting their guilt and accepting their punishment, which must come immediately. So these are some of the extraordinary statements which Camus they're not Camus saying them, he's quoting other people that have been involved in imagining and actually setting up this revolutionary society, which was partially achieved in the Soviet Union. And then he goes on to summarise some of this. So we've been looking at the chapter of Camus' book, The Rebel, which dealt with various historical rebellions. He started off with the French Rebellion in the 18th century and then looked at others after that. And he talked about what he called irrational terror, by which he meant basically the fascist Nazi-like states. And then rational terror, by which he meant communism. So what he says was, in the early stages, particularly going back to the French Revolution, people set out to kill God by killing his representative. So he spoke about the fact that the king was regarded as being a representative on earth of God. Whether that was true or not, he was regarded by that under the social contract. People said, well, the king has the authority to rule because he's received that authority from God. So we must if we kill the king and perhaps also kill the religious leaders, we're eliminating God's representatives and we're a step towards this freedom that we're aspiring to. So that, Camus says, was the underlying principle and practice of these early revolutions. In the 20th century, he says, they had to finish the job by not just killing the representatives of God, but killing what remained of God anyway in the form of principles. So things like morality, a sense of right and wrong, justice and law, they had to be wiped out. They were still vestiges of God that still were there in our society. So the 20th century revolutions were intended to eliminate those and to some extent achieve that. So again, talking about what he called the irrational terror, that's basically Hitler and those people, he says they were achieving a kind of Nietzschean Superman. So Nietzsche in his book Das Spoke Zarathustra spoke about human beings, or at least some of them, achieving in their own minds the status of a Superman. So in that irrational terror, Camus summarises that as meaning it was an exaltation of the executioner by the executioner. So a small group of people were able to suppress and kill off a lot of other people, and in doing so, apparently achieving this kind of Superman state. So by subjugating a large amount of humanity, a few happy few were able to liberate themselves and become supermen. So the executioners themselves exalted their own status as executioner. On the other hand, in what Camus calls the rational terror, which we've been looking at, which is basically communism, in particular the Soviet Union model of communism, he describes that as exaltation of the executioner by the victim. So all men, the whole of society, all of humanity, agrees to be subjugated and to be killed. So all men are liberated by all becoming slaves. We've talked about that earlier in this episode and in previous episodes. This end point where no one will be oppressed if everyone is a slave. So we've seen all these quotations that Camus put forward. And then the question is, what does Camus himself really think about that? And I think that's the point of these talks, really. But unfortunately, there's not going to be enough room on this particular episode to do that. So that might have to be the subject of next week's talk. But basically, I think it seems to me that there's a significant conflict in Camus' mind as he goes through this book, although he doesn't altogether admit that. But anyway, we'll look at that next week.